to welcome you all to John Corino's talk. Just say a couple things about John. John is a professor of philosophy at Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan. John has been writing and speaking about homosexuality and ethics for over a decade now. I know John from University of Texas at Austin, where we were graduate students together, and John does a great job and is a very interesting speaker and also excellent responder to questions. So I hope you all will have questions for him, and there'll be time after the lecture portion of his speech to address those questions. As mentioned, he is the author of the book, not the editor of the book, Same Sex. When John is in his normal role as philosophy professor, he specializes in ethics and the philosophy of David Hume. So please join me in welcoming John Corino.
Thank you, David, and I want to thank you all for coming out today. And I want to jump right in because I realize a lot of you are on your lunch hour. And my plan is to talk for about an hour and then leave some time for questions. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. I've got kind of a drone from air conditioning or something here, and I don't know if you're hearing that as loudly as I am. I want to start with a little thought experiment. Suppose I told you that I'm imagining an activity that takes place between consenting adults, doesn't hurt anybody, and results in pleasure for the people involved, and that's all you know about the activities I'm imagining. Well, given that information, you might say, that sounds pretty good. Suppose I fill it in a little more and say, not only does this result in pleasure for the people involved, but it's an avenue of meaning and a source of long-term fulfillment in their lives. And again, that's all you know about the activity that I'm thinking of. Well, given that information, you would say, well, this seems like the kind of thing we'd want to encourage. Consenting adults, gives them pleasure, a source of fulfillment in their lives. But of course, if I fill in the picture a little more, and tell you that the adults in question are two men or two women, and the activity is some kind of sexual activity, suddenly people are not so keen on that anymore. In fact, not only do many people think that that's wrong, they think it's a moral abomination. And this reaction is a little bit strange if the description I gave is an accurate one. Consenting adults, doesn't hurt anyone, results in long-term pleasure and fulfillment. Consider the fact that right now there are thousands of people across the world having sex. It's kind of disconcerting when you think about it, especially when you realize you're sitting here listening to me. Some of those people are with partners of the same race, and some of them are with partners of a different race. Some of them are with partners of the same age. Some of them are in what we call May-December relationships. Some of them have known each other for a long time. Some of them met this weekend at the church. Some of them are in loving, nurturing relationships. Some of them are in abusive relationships. Now, these are all factors of varying moral significance. But when I say some of these people are with partners of the same sex, and some of them are with partners of the other sex, that seems to have a significance all its own, morally speaking. And the question I want to explore this afternoon is why? What's morally wrong with homosexuality, if anything? And if nothing, what's all the fuss about? And I think this is an important time for us to talk about this, not just because it's National Coming Out Day yesterday, and this week is National Coming Out Week, and we can say more about that later, but also because we're in the middle of an election cycle where gay marriage has become an issue, and where the various candidates have staked out positions on gay marriage. And very often people's thoughts about gay marriage are shaped about their moral views on homosexuality, whether they think homosexual relationships are morally acceptable or not. So this could have relevance to how we vote in the upcoming election. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at some common arguments that people offer against homosexuality. And they actually, if I had a board, I'd put it up. It's pretty simple. It's 4 that we're going to look at. So for those of you who are taking notes, the first is that the Bible condemns it. The second is that it's not universalizable. That's not a word you get to use every day, so I'll explain what that means when we get there. the third is that it's harmful, and the fourth is that it's unnatural. And so we're going to examine each of those arguments. But before I examine the arguments, there are a few sort of preliminary things I want to get out of the way. First of all, what are we talking about today? We're talking about homosexuality. And at this point, a lot of people like to make a distinction between homosexual orientation, that is having certain feelings, dispositions, and homosexual activity. And like many such distinctions, this is both useful and problematic. It's useful because it reminds us that we don't always act on all the feelings we have, and sometimes we should. Sometimes I want to strangle the people in front of me online at the supermarket. I don't do that, okay? So we don't always act on our feelings. It's problematic because like many of these distinctions, it tends to oversimplify the phenomena involved. And in particular, I think here we tend to oversimplify both the notion of sexual orientation and the notion of sexual activity. So I want to say a little bit about that before I go into the arguments. When I talk about sexual activity, what am I talking about? You know, is there intercourse? Okay. What about kissing? What about holding hands? What about going for a walk with somebody in a romantic evening on the beach? I want you to think of all the activities that people engage in that make up part of their romantic lives. We may not call all of these sexual, but romantic lives. And when we think about heterosexuality, we tend to think of that broad range of activities. When we think about homosexuality, we tend to focus on the sex part, the intercourse part. And this is a problem because I think it gives us a kind of false dichotomy or a skewed view of people's lives, where heterosexual people have relationships and homosexual people have sex. And this is not the only time we have those kinds of dichotomies. Say, heterosexual people have lives, homosexual people have lifestyles. I live in southeastern Michigan. No one there has a lifestyle. Heterosexual people have a moral vision. Homosexual people have an agenda. Okay, the words that we use to describe these things, and often we're talking about the same things, but we have these words that sort of color our perception of what we're talking about, and it's really important to keep that in mind. I'm going to be talking about arguments against homosexual sex because that's the part that bothers people. But homosexual people, like heterosexual people, have a wide range of activities that make up their romantic relationships. Let me turn and say a little bit about the notion of sexual orientation, which we also tend to oversimplify when we talk about it. I have a particular sexual orientation. What does that mean? Well, I'm attracted to people of a certain gender, this is true. But I'm also attracted to people of a certain age range, certain body type, certain kind of sense of humor, certain personality type. All of these things are aspects of my sexual orientation broadly understood, but we like to focus on the gender aspect of that and then divide people into neat categories. There are heterosexual people and homosexual people, and then there are bisexual people, and for some reason that confuses people when we talk about it. Everywhere I go, people say, I just don't understand bisexuality. So I want to say a few words about it. It's not a complicated concept, really, but I want to explain. Some people are attracted to both men and women. That's it. I said it's not a complicated concept. This does not mean that they're attracted to everyone, which would be really exhausting. It does not mean that gender is not important to what makes people attractive to them. It just means that it's not an overriding factor. And I think it's important to keep that in mind, because many of the challenges faced by homosexual people are equally faced by bisexual people. They don't get half fired from their jobs or half bashed or half harassed because they're bisexual. Okay, final preliminary point before we jump into the arguments. I'm going to be looking at arguments against homosexuality. And over the years I've been doing this, as Dave mentioned, I've been doing this for over a dozen years, actually. Yes, I started when I was 12. But in the dozen or so years I've been doing this, people have said to me, you know, your approach seems so negative. You're always talking about arguments against homosexuality. Why don't you ever come up with an argument for homosexual relationships? And I said, you know, that's a good point. So let me think about that for a moment, take a moment. And I think there is an argument in favor, and it's pretty simple and straightforward, and it goes like this. Homosexual relationships make some people happy. When I say it makes them happy, I don't just mean that it's pleasurable. I mean that this is a source of fulfillment in some people's lives. Maybe not your life, but some people find fulfillment this way. And normally when people find that kind of fulfillment in their lives, we think this is a good thing. We want to encourage that, people finding that special someone and settling down and expressing that in ways that words are sometimes not even adequate for. This is the kind of thing we celebrate everywhere from great literature to trashy television shows, that connecting with somebody. Normally we think of that as a wonderful thing. Some people happen to do that with people of the same sex. If we're going to tell them that's wrong, we better have a good reason. So now what I want to do is look at some of the reasons. And as I said, the first reason I'm going to mention is that the Bible says so. And when I say the Bible, I'm going to be talking about what people sometimes call the Judeo-Christian Bible, although I don't particularly like that term. It tends to lump together Judaism and Christianity into one sort of mass thing, and it's not very respectful to the Jewish tradition, I think, for that reason. And it's also important to remind ourselves that that is by no means the only religious tradition out there. But it's certainly one that seems to play a dominant role in politics and social discussions in this country, so I need to talk about this a little bit. And you've probably heard people quote from the Bible where it says, "Man shall not lie with man as with woman. It is an abomination unto God." The Bible says that. Of course, the Bible says other things in that very same book that people don't tend to pay a lot of attention to. The Bible says that you should not wear clothing of mixed fiber. Cotton polyester blends, not in the book of Leviticus. The Bible says that you should not eat shellfish. Same book. Shrimp cocktail, not in Leviticus. The Bible says you should not touch the carcass of a dead pig. Football, not in Leviticus. People tend to quote very selectively from the Bible when they're talking about things that bother them, and they don't recognize that the Bible says a number of things that at least strike me, and maybe would strike you, as bad moral advice. The Bible says that people who divorce and remarry should be put to death. I don't think that's very good moral advice. The Bible says that slavery is morally acceptable. I tell this to people, they don't believe me, so I say, okay, I'll read to you. This is also from the book of Leviticus. This is chapter 25, verses 44 to 46, and it says, "You may acquire male and female slaves from among the aliens residing with you, and from their families that are with you, who have been born into your land, and they may be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children to inherit, for them to inherit as property." Who says this according to the Bible? God says that according to the Bible. We read that and say, how could God endorse slavery? There's something incoherent about the notion of an all-good God endorsing an institution that we know to be a bad institution. So how do we deal with those sorts of passages? Well, I think there are a couple of ways you can go. One thing you can do is say, look, the Bible is just wrong about certain things. To say that, this is important, to say that is not to say that God is wrong, but that maybe human beings have been wrong in interpreting what God has had to say. We should not confuse complete faith in God with complete faith in our ability to discern God's voice. And the Bible was written over history by a variety of different authors, and we shouldn't be surprised if some of their prejudices work their way in there. But some people don't want to say that. There are biblical literalists who want to say that everything the Bible says must be true. And I say to them, well, hey, the Bible says that you may make slaves of the people around you and your children may inherit them. How do you deal with that? And what they usually tell me is, John, you can't pull that out of its historical context. That passage was written in a certain historical context, and you're pulling it out of its historical context. And I say, okay, but if you think it's important to look at historical context when talking about slavery, why is it not also important to talk about historical context when discussing homosexuality? After all, what the biblical authors had in mind is very different from what we have in mind when they talked about man lying with man. What did the biblical authors have in mind? Well, they had certain pagan practices in mind. Interestingly, every mention of same-sex conduct in the Bible, or virtually every mention, is in the context of talking about the chosen people and how they differ from those other people over there who engage in certain practices. If what the biblical authors are concerned about are pagan practices, that's different from what I'm talking about here today. They also, at least in the New Testament, had Greek pederasty in mind, older men and younger boys. If that's what they're thinking of, then what they're talking about and what I'm talking about are two different things. So I'm not saying, look, forget the Bible's wrong. Maybe the Bible is wrong about certain things. What I am saying is that if you are going to take the Bible seriously, you have to understand that the biblical author's concerns, what they're talking about, may be quite different from what we're talking about here today. And then pulling passages out like man shall not lie with man is pulling the passage out of context. Now, having said that, I don't think that people's main problem with homosexuality or their main objection to homosexuality is genuinely religious. Why do I say this? Well, I was very briefly, before I went to the University of Texas, a graduate student at Notre Dame. At Notre Dame, we were told we could not have a gay and lesbian student group on campus because that would conflict with Catholic teaching. And over again, the administration went out of its way to point out to us that having a gay and lesbian group would conflict with Catholic teaching. Interestingly, we did have a Muslim student group on campus and a Jewish student group on campus. Muslims and Jews both deny the divinity of Christ, which when I went to Catholic school was a very important part of Catholic teaching. This wasn't about Catholic teaching, this was about something else. And so what I now want to do is explore what that something else might be, and I want to turn to some of these other non-religious arguments. And this is especially important if we're going to be talking about public policy issues, because in public policy issues, as long as we have freedom of religion, we probably shouldn't be quoting the Bible to back up specific stances we take on laws and so on. So the first of these arguments that I want to look at is this argument that homosexuality is wrong because it is not universalizable. I said you don't get to use that word every day. What does it mean? Well, the first time I ever heard this argument, I was giving a version of this lecture back in 1992 at St. John's University in New York, where I did my undergraduate work. And after I gave the lecture, one of the priests who worked at St. John's wrote to the school paper and he was very upset about my lecture, and he responded with a bunch of criticisms. And one of the criticisms he offered, his name was Father Pryor. Father Pryor said, "Of course homosexuality is bad for society. If everyone were homosexual, there would be no society." And I became interested in this argument, if everyone were homosexual, there would be no society. And I call this the universalizability argument. The idea is, if everyone were, okay. I thought it was nice that Father Pryor took the time out to write to the school paper, so I said, I'm going to do the same thing. I wrote an open letter to him that was published in the school paper. I said, "Dear Father Pryor, if everyone were a Roman Catholic priest, there would be no society either. Sincerely, John Corino." What's the problem with this argument? Well, he starts off with this presupposition that we all have this obligation to procreate. And clearly he doesn't believe that. I assume he doesn't believe that he has an obligation to procreate. But the interesting thing is that even if you accept that presupposition, even if you think that there's this universal obligation to procreate, that is not an argument against homosexuality. At best, it's an argument against exclusive homosexuality, or not even that. Now, think about it. Homosexual activity doesn't prevent people from procreating any more than you're sitting here listening to this lecture prevents you from procreating. I mean, none of you are procreating right now, I assume. I can't really see in the back of the room. But... Okay, so homosexual people, insofar as they engage in homosexual activity, are not procreating. But in fact, some of them do procreate, either through previous relationships or through artificial insemination or something like that. And clearly, Father Pryor is not going to be okay with that. He's like, okay, as long as they're procreating, that's fine, then they can do whatever else they want. So we need a better argument than this universalizability argument. So now I'm going to turn to the argument that says that homosexuality is wrong because it's harmful. And this is going to be, actually, I'm going to take a little more time on this one, because this is sort of not just one argument, but a broad category of arguments. People have accused homosexual people of all kinds of social ills being responsible for this. Homosexuality has been linked to disease, the breakdown of the family, drug abuse, suicide, long lines at the supermarket, I don't know. Just about any bad thing you can think of, at some point people have pointed to homosexual people and blamed them for it. I used to think I was exaggerating when I said this until September 11th happened. And Jerry Falwell, you remember this? He actually came out and said, I point my finger at the gays. And the amazing thing was not that he said it. I thought the amazing thing was the sort of collective reaction that everyone had. Even people who would normally agree with Jerry Falwell kind of said, what a dumbass. Because, really, because it was such a clear example of scapegoating. At a time in our national consciousness where it was so important for us to come together as Americans, and he decided, no, this would be a good time to blame gay people for something and scapegoat them. And people realized, shouldn't be doing that right now. That's not the time. Sadly, how quickly they forget, and now in the debates about gay marriage, again, we're hearing about homosexual people causing the breakdown of the family and all these other things. So what do we want to say about some of these claims? Well, first thing you have to ask is whether they're true. Is homosexuality really responsible for these things? And if you want to get a sense of the lives of gay and lesbian people, it seems that one way to go about doing that would be to ask gay and lesbian people. Though interestingly, the people who make these claims often don't want to have anything to do with gay and lesbian people. So it puts them in a difficult position to make authoritative pronouncements on gay and lesbian lives. So how do they do it? Well, you say we can point to statistics and scientific studies. And there are some problems here. Of course, one of the problems you're fully aware of is that it seems like you can come up with statistics and scientific studies to support just about any position. This does not mean that all studies are equally good or equally bad. It does mean that we ought to be cautious before we start pulling these statistics out and using them as weapons in our arguments with one another. But there's an even deeper problem when talking about statistical claims surrounding sexual orientation. Because in order to make any kind of reasonable comparison between homosexual people on the one hand and heterosexual people on the other, you need some way of distinguishing between the two groups. You need some way of separating the homosexual people from the heterosexual people for the purpose of study. How do we do this? We ask people, are you homosexual or heterosexual? And in a society that stigmatizes homosexuality, a lot of people don't answer that question honestly. I've known a number of people who have stayed in the closet until they're 40, 50, even 60 years old, and no amount of scientific pressure is going to drag them out sooner, which makes it very difficult to substantiate claims about homosexual people in general, heterosexual people in general. It's not like you can just sort of check behind somebody's ear. You have to ask them questions, and people often don't want to answer those questions. This complicates the studies. Fortunately, I don't think we need to settle those statistical debates in order to settle some of the moral arguments surrounding this. Why do I say this? Well, one reason I say this is because correlation is not the same thing as cause. Even if you could point out some kind of correlation between homosexual conduct on the one hand and these bad things on the other, that still wouldn't mean that the homosexual conduct caused these bad things to happen. In fact, there's something here I call the argument of the bully. Imagine this. Imagine a bully on the playground, knocks down another kid, the kid starts crying, teacher comes over and says, why did you hit the kid? And the bully says, I hit him because he's crying and that bothers me. And the teacher says, wait a second, he's crying because you hit him. And the bully says, yeah, and if he keeps crying, I'm going to hit him again. Now, think about somebody like, Dr. Laura. Speaking of bullies, Dr. Laura says things like, homosexual people live miserable, unhappy lives, and I say, if that's true, why do you think that might be? Could it have anything to do with the fact that people like you keep attacking them? It's the argument of the bully. The bully justifies his claims on the grounds that he doesn't like the results. Dr. Laura says, they live miserable, unhappy lives. If that's true, it might be because there are people attacking gay and lesbian people all the time. And so we're not fairly judging their lives. We're putting extra pressure on people and then wondering why they seem to face more problems than other people, if indeed they do. Okay, you might say, but what about AIDS? Doesn't homosexuality cause AIDS? No. A virus causes AIDS. And that virus can be passed along by homosexual conduct, by heterosexual conduct, by conduct that's not sexual at all. Think about the fact that it is infinitely more risky, just isolating AIDS risk for a moment, it is infinitely more risky for me to have sex with an HIV-positive woman than with an HIV-negative man. Why? Because homosexuality doesn't cause AIDS, the virus causes AIDS. And if the virus isn't present, two men can have sex for days on end without worrying about AIDS. Fatigue, yes. AIDS, no. It's not as if when two men get into bed together, AIDS just sort of spontaneously appears like mold on bread or something. The virus has got to be there beforehand. And people often talk about AIDS as if they don't recognize this fact. Indeed, if AIDS risk were supposed to tell us something about the moral status of these activities, the result of that, the implication of that would be kind of interesting. Because if it's wrong for me to have sex with men because doing so puts me at a higher risk for contracting HIV, it should also be wrong for women to have sex with men because doing that puts them at a higher risk for HIV than lesbian sex does. From the standpoint of AIDS risk, lesbian sex is the way to go. Think about this. Surgeon General recommends lesbian. And if AIDS risk is supposed to somehow correspond to morality, lesbians would seem to be the most moral people in the world. Clearly there are some steps missing in the argument, not that I don't think that might well be true, but this is not where the argument is supposed to be heading. The general problem with all of the arguments of this type, they seem to be of the form, all homosexual sex is risky, all risky behavior is immoral, therefore all homosexual sex is immoral. That argument goes wrong in two places, the first premise and the second premise. They're both false. Some homosexual sex is risky, some heterosexual sex is risky, some activities that are not sexual at all are risky. Driving on the highway is risky. Some risky behavior is immoral, some is not. There are too many holes in the argument. Now it's interesting. I told you I learned a lot from the question-answer period in this talk, and I look forward to it. And one of the things I learned over the years as I would go through that argument is there was another argument on people's minds having to do with risk and homosexual conduct. But it took me a while to figure out what it was. Because often I would give the lecture, and sometime after the lecture, somebody would raise his hand and start trying to ask a question. And I would say trying to ask a question because it was clearly difficult for these people to get the question out and say what it was they wanted to say. It would go something like this. Okay, but isn't it true, like when two men get into bed together, that there's like risk there because, you know, the parts don't fit, and so if the parts don't fit, that could be harmful because when two men have sex together. Think about this. It's like, oh, I say, are you trying to ask me about anal sex? Oh my God, he said anal sex in Texas. Arrest him. I mean, it was really, people would, because this was, you know, when you talk about homosexuality, people often think of male homosexuality. When they think about male homosexuality, they think about anal sex. That really bothers them. It's icky. They don't want to talk about it, but it's on their mind. And so I thought, you know, insofar as I'm trying to address people's arguments, I need to address this argument, even though it's uncomfortable for people to talk about this, because it was on people's minds. And so we've got this parts don't fit argument, to which I have two responses. Ready? Okay. First response, yes they do. How do I know this? Well, because if they didn't, people would try it, it wouldn't work, and they'd go do something else. I mean, just imagine the scenarios. Oh my God, the parts don't fit. What are we going to do? I don't know. Want to go bowling? Sure. This is not working. Gay people are not stupid, all right? Let's be mature here. Gay people, I actually would have people, during the question-answer period of the lecture, I've actually had a number of people do this. Well, and I'm like, if you're doing it this way, you're doing it wrong. What do you want me to tell you? The gay people sort of sit around, I don't know, the parts don't fit. What are we going to do? It sort of made me understand why people have such a problem conceptualizing and theorizing lesbianism, because they think it's like... I mean, you start wondering what goes through people's minds here. All right. So, okay. Clearly the parts do fit, because if they didn't, we wouldn't be talking about this. So why does that bother you? All right. Well, this is the second part of my response, which is that, look, even if you've got an argument against a particular sexual practice, for example, anal sex, that's not tantamount to an argument against homosexuality. Why? Because not all homosexual people engage in anal sex, many other things that they do. Not only homosexual people engage in anal sex. This is also surprising to some audiences. I guess they don't read Cosmo or whatever. funny story about Strom Thurmond. Do you know who Strom Thurmond was? He was a senator from South Carolina. Was in the Senate until he was like 117 years old or something like that. And there was a debate on the Senate floor about sodomy laws. Now, understand something. Before sodomy laws were struck down a couple of years ago in Lawrence versus Texas, two things were true. One is that most of them were outlawed both anal sex and oral sex. A lot of people don't realize that in most states that have sodomy laws, oral sex counted as sodomy. Second, of the laws that existed at that time, about half of them applied both to homosexual conduct and to heterosexual conduct. And somebody pointed out on the Senate floor, said, you know, I mean, these things we're talking about, especially oral sex, heterosexual people do that too. And Strom Thurmond actually stood up and said, no, they don't. And suddenly I understood why he was so cranky. When we talk about these things, let's be realistic. Let's go back to something I said much earlier. There's a wide range of activity that all kinds of people, heterosexual and homosexual people, engage in when they're trying to express affection for each other. Some of those you might be into, some of those you might not be into. But be careful that you don't put together an argument against homosexuality that's going to equally apply to heterosexuality or only apply to a certain subset of homosexuality. Okay, I've been talking about a lot of harm arguments, and before I move on to the nature arguments, I want to talk about one more kind of harm argument. Because all the ones I've been discussing say that homosexuality is wrong because it's harmful for the people who engage in it. But of course, a lot of people who object to homosexuality because they think it's harmful to society at large. And we hear a lot of these claims about this threat to the moral fabric of our nation, this threat to the nation's infrastructure, and so on. And so I want to pause for a minute and talk about that argument, that this somehow is a threat. And I want to talk about one specific version of it, that it's a threat to marriage and the family. What does that mean? Why is it, how is it a threat to marriage and the family? Do people think that if we allow gay and lesbian people to have relationships, that people will stop having heterosexual relationships? This seems really implausible. The usual response to a gay person is not, hey, no fair, how come he gets to be gay and I don't? If we allow homosexual relationships, it doesn't mean that people are going to stop having heterosexual relationships. In fact, there was one columnist who I thought put it brilliantly. It was kind of crude, but the line sort of captured it all. If we allow gay marriage, it doesn't mean your wife is going to grow a penis. If you don't want to do that, that's fine, but how does it take anything away from you? How is it a threat to heterosexual marriage that other people who are not heterosexual want to form their own relationships and love and nurture each other and protect each other and all of that? I'm going to even take this a step further. Not only do I think that these arguments about homosexuality threatening the family are groundless, not only do I think that this is just a big smokescreen, I actually think they're counterproductive. I actually think that the family and children are more threatened by these arguments and their effects than they are by any homosexual conduct. Why do I think this? Let me tell you another story. A number of years ago when I lived in New York, there was a man I knew from the community in church. He had a wife and several small kids. And one night I saw him out at a gay bar. And I was very surprised by this because, like I said, I knew Joe was married with a wife and small kids. And at first I wasn't sure it was him, although every time I look over at him he'd do this, and I said, yeah, it's probably him. So finally I just went up and tapped him on the shoulder and said, hey Joe, what are you doing here? And he said, well, look, when I grew up, and he was about 10 years older than I am, and at the time he was probably in his 30s, I would say, quite some time ago. When I grew up, he said, gay relationships, that just wasn't an option for me. And I felt a lot of pressure to do the right thing, which meant to marry a woman. And that's what I did, and, because I felt that was the right thing to do, and I felt a lot of pressure to do that, and it's not working out quite right for me, and now I'm living this double life. Now, I think this is very sad. And I don't want to excuse his behavior because he's deceiving his wife and his kids. And I think that that's wrong. On the other hand, I've never walked in his shoes, and I don't know what kind of pressure he's felt over the years. Put all of that aside for a moment. I'm we can talk about what to say about Joe, but I want you to put all that aside for just a moment. The point I want to make here is that we would have many fewer such situations if we just recognize the fact that heterosexual marriage is not for everybody. And we don't do anybody any good by pressuring people into situations that are not good for them. Doesn't do Joe any good, doesn't do his wife any good, doesn't do his kids any good. Some people are gay. It makes no sense to pressure them into heterosexual relationships. In fact, it seems to me to be the antithesis of family values. Okay, let me turn now then to the final category of arguments which say that homosexuality is wrong because it is unnatural. And it's interesting to think about this argument as well because it's not really clear what people mean by unnatural. I mean, there are a lot of things that are unnatural in some sense, right? Clothing is unnatural in some sense. Buildings are unnatural in some sense. No one thinks that we should be doing this naked and outside. Maybe some of you do, whatever. So what do we mean when we say homosexuality is unnatural, and why is that a bad thing? So let's look at some of the things we might mean. We might mean that it's unnatural in the sense that most people don't do that. So it's abnormal in the statistical sense. It's true that most people don't engage in homosexual relationships. But then again, most people don't write left-handed. Most people don't play the mandolin. Most people don't read Sanskrit. Most people don't put their campus buildings in brew pubs. Yeah, just because something is unusual doesn't mean that it's morally wrong. Okay, so yeah, most people don't do that, but that doesn't explain why it's a bad thing. All right, what else do we mean? Well, we might think about animals when we think about what's natural and unnatural. I had a student last semester who said to me, Professor Corino, I think homosexuality is unnatural because animals don't do that. I mean, he said, you haven't done the reading, have you? It's like, well, no, I haven't. Okay, fine. Let's talk about this for a moment. Animals don't do that. Do you really think that animals give us our standards for moral behavior? And he's like, yeah, sure. So I got down on the ground and started humping his leg. Actually, I didn't do that, but if I had tenure, I would have. Animals do not provide us with our moral standards, especially in the area of sexual behavior, number one. Number two, there are plenty of animals that engage not just in homosexual conduct, but even form homosexual pair bonds. So looking to animals is not going to give people the argument they want against homosexuality. Well, what else do we mean by homosexuality being unnatural? Well, a lot of people are really interested in this nature-nurture debate, where they talk about the cause or origin of sexual orientation. And over the years, it seems like there are sort of two sides that have formed to this debate. There's one side that says, look, we were born this way, therefore it's natural, therefore it's okay. And there's another side that says, no, it's a lifestyle choice, therefore it's unnatural, therefore it's wrong. I think those are both really lousy arguments, both of them. So let me talk about each one. First of all, I was born this way, therefore it's natural, therefore it's okay. Well, for one thing, I don't remember what life was like when I was born, and neither do you. And the best thing we could say is I've had these feelings for a very long time. All right, fine, but this goes to the other part of it. Just because you've had feelings for a long time doesn't mean you should act on them. I might have had violent feelings for as long as I can remember, but if I start smacking the people in the front row, nobody's going to say, it's okay, he was born that way. So you don't settle the morality of an activity just by looking at the origin of the disposition toward this activity. On the other hand, it says it's a lifestyle choice, therefore it's unnatural, therefore it's wrong. Well, what do you mean it's a lifestyle choice? Do we mean people choose to have homosexual feelings? This seems impossible. Think about whether you choose your own sexual feelings. Have you ever had sexual or romantic feelings towards someone that you wished you didn't have feelings for? Maybe that person was already in a relationship with somebody else. Maybe you were already in a relationship with somebody else. Maybe the person just hated your guts. Okay, we've all had this experience of having, we don't have that kind of direct control over our sexual feelings. And if we did, why would anyone choose to be gay in a society that stigmatizes homosexuality? So what they must mean is they must mean the activity is chosen. Whether you actually engage in homosexual relationships, that's a choice. To which my response is, duh, yeah, of course that's a choice, but you still haven't told me why that's a bad choice. Think about it this way. I am probably naturally right-handed, in that I've always written with my right hand. Everybody in my family writes with their right hand. There doesn't seem to be any genetic predisposition for left-handed writing in my family. But if I were to pick up a pen and start writing with my left hand, you wouldn't say, sinner, wrong. There was a time in history when people would have done that. People were burned at the stake for being left-handed. We think that's crazy, but it has nothing to do with whether left-handedness is something that you're born with, or that you acquire in early childhood, or even something you just sort of arbitrarily choose to do. We will not settle the moral debate by looking at this nature-nurture debate. It's interesting, but it's not going to settle the moral debate. So what else might we mean by unnatural? Well, the big argument, the one that gets mentioned most of all, is that it's unnatural because it violates the purpose of our sexual organs. This comes from the natural law tradition, sometimes associated with St. Thomas Aquinas, and earlier with Aristotle. And the idea is that all of our organs have certain natural purposes for which they were designed, perhaps. Eyes are for seeing, ears are for hearing, genitals are for procreating. To use your organs for some purpose other than their natural purpose is unnatural and therefore wrong. What do we want to say about this argument? Well, first thing to say is that a lot of our organs seem to have multiple purposes. I can use my mouth for talking, for singing, for breathing, for licking stamps, for blowing bubbles, for kissing a woman, or for kissing a man. And it seems awfully arbitrary to say that all of those are natural except the last one. Now you might say, okay, well the licking stamps and so on, that's not a natural use of your mouth, but it's okay. Well, in that case you haven't specified a morally relevant sense of unnatural. I'm going to say, okay, so the fact that something is unnatural, so what? Why does that matter? Now, take the genital organs. Obviously, one very important purpose of those organs is to procreate. We know this. Being the president of the debate, I know that, yeah. Gay people know this, that the genital organs are for procreating. But is that the only purpose they have? Heterosexual people often have sex even if they don't want children. They don't want children yet. They don't want any more children. They can't have children. What are they doing? No. It's they recognize that there are other purposes for the sexual organs, including expression of intimacy, feelings of mutual pleasure, a kind of special romantic communication between people. Even the Roman Catholic Church, which is by no means a permissive organization, allows that sterile couples, heterosexual couples, can get married, or that wives who are pregnant can have sex with their husbands, even though that can't result in procreation. Why? Because they must recognize that there are these other purposes to sexual expression. And if these purposes are open to heterosexual people, it seems only fair that they be open to homosexual people. When it comes right down to it, I think that the unnaturalness claim is really a dressed-up way of saying, that's gross, or that's disgusting. And I don't doubt that a lot of people think that homosexuality is gross or disgusting. But the fact that something is gross or disgusting or that you don't like it doesn't mean that it's morally wrong. At best, that expresses a kind of aesthetic judgment, not a moral judgment. I mean, you might think lots of things are gross. You might think eating broccoli is gross. You might think scrubbing the shower is gross. I teach at Wayne State University in Detroit. We have one of the largest mortuary science programs in the country. And because I teach ethics, a lot of their students come to me at some point and take my classes. Some of my students touch dead people on a regular basis. I think that's really gross. They hand in their papers. I'm like, but the fact that most of us think that's gross doesn't mean that it's wrong. All right, what have I done? I've looked at some of the most common arguments against homosexuality and explained to you why I don't think they work. Before I wrap up, I want to spend a moment reflecting a little bit on the question of, well, what's the problem here? If there are no good reasons, why do people have these objections? In fact, many people do. Why? Well, I think a big part of it is what I said just a moment ago. People think it's gross. It bothers them. And that's partly because they're not familiar with it. Strange and unfamiliar things we sometimes just have a kind of visceral reaction to. I don't like that. I'm not into that. It must be wrong. What's the solution to that problem? Well, I think there are a lot of possible solutions. And I'm not an expert in this area. But I think a big part of the solution has to be getting to know real-life gay and lesbian people so that you could put a face on the issue and realize that gay and lesbian people have many of the same hopes and dreams, fears, desires, goals as anybody else. Now, this puts a kind of responsibility on all of this. It puts a responsibility on those of us who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, all kinds of sexual minorities, to come out and be open. And that's not always easy to do. And that's one reason why we have coming out. It puts a responsibility on everybody else to try to be more understanding, more welcoming, more open to hearing the truth about people's lives. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, well, wait a second now, look. Whatever you want to do that, fine, it's your own business, I might not understand it. But what do you got now? You're going to go around flaunting it and so on, this coming out thing, you're going to stand up and declare your sexuality. What do you got to do all of that for? And I've heard this before. I remember the first time I really heard this argument forcefully, it was from my own mother. Back some 15 years ago or so, when I came out. That might be her right now. Where's that? Back some 15 years ago, I came out, and my mother used to argue about this all the time. And one of the things she said to me, she said, look, why do you have to be so open about this? Your father and I are not open about our sexuality. I want you to think about that sentence for just a moment. Your father and I are not open about our sexuality. Not only is that woman openly heterosexual, she's open about having had sex at least once. Heterosexual people do this. They refer to their husbands and wives, their boyfriends, their girlfriends, the people that they have crushes on or interested in, actors and actresses they think are sexy, whatever. And that's perfectly normal. We do the exact same thing and suddenly we're flaunting it. We're shoving it down people's throats. It's another one of those kinds of double standards that I was talking to you about earlier. I don't want to pick on my mother because over the years she's gotten much, much better. And I'll tell you another quick story about her. A couple of years ago, I was home with my partner, and my parents took us out to dinner at a restaurant where they go rather frequently. And at one point, one of the waitresses walked by, and they go there often enough that they know all of the waiters and waitresses by name. And my mother said, oh, Beth, come over here. I want you to meet my son and his partner. I nearly spit my food out across the table when she said that. What have you done with my mother? Who is it? That was such a powerful moment. It was a powerful moment for the simple reason that my mother was being honest about, and she didn't refer to him as my friend or my roommate. And you can almost hear the quote marks around it. This is John's roommate. But it was also a powerful moment because of what it did for that waitress. Someday, that waitress may have a gay son or a lesbian daughter, and she may remember that Corino's went out to dinner with their gay son and they just had a nice dinner. And that's a powerful message, but it requires us to have the courage to stand up and come out, as my mother did that day, as the mother of the gay son. And that courage is moral courage, which brings me to my final point today. And if you remember nothing else from what I said today, I want you to remember this. Morality is important. Morality is important. We had to bring you from Detroit to tell us this. Listen to what I'm saying here. So many people think that my goal is to come and attack morality, or to tell you that morality is a private matter that you should keep to yourself, or that you shouldn't push on other people, or do whatever you feel, or so on. Nothing could be further from the truth. Because so much of what I said today depends upon my moral convictions. My convictions about fairness, my convictions about how we ought to treat one another. I think the way society treats gay and lesbian people is wrong. Not just irrational, but morally troubling. And when people say, and they're usually very well-meaning people, say, morality is a private matter, I usually say, bullshit. It's a technical philosophical term, you can write it down. Bullshit. Morality is about how we treat one another. It's about the standards that we aspire to and want other people to aspire to. And it's very important for us to put forth that moral vision. So be very clear on this. I'm not telling you to stop making moral judgments. I'm telling you to make sure that you have reasons for the moral judgments that you make. I'm asking you to put yourself in people's shoes before you judge them. And I'm asking you to judge people not on whom they love, but on whether they love. That's my moral vision. That's my agenda. And I thank you for all listening so patiently to it today. Thank you very much. I know some of you have class in about 15 minutes, but I really hope we have some time for questions and discussion.
You talked about the biblical arguments of homosexuality, which I think is one of the larger arguments because they use God as the authority for their argument. And the biggest thing I don't understand, I come from a very strong religious family. I don't talk anymore because of my homosexuality, but I'm confirmed Lutheran, baptized. You know, I used to believe in all that, but I totally rejected religion because of these arguments. I just give a crap and I don't. They just don't agree. But one of the biggest things, you talk about the Leviticus and how they use those arguments from Leviticus, that is the Old Testament. There's a book called the New Testament, and the New Testament exists because Jesus Christ died in one of the most powerful ways a human being can to relinquish us from those old world views, and a new contract was made called the New Testament that we live by now. And so I'm wondering how you can tie in anything from the New Testament that can give a role into this discussion.
Sure. It is true that the passages I quoted when I was talking about the Bible were passages from the Hebrew Scriptures, or what people call the Old Testament. And it's also true that for Christians, the connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament is kind of complex. Right? Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. So it's not as if Christians ignore the Old Testament. It's not as if there's nothing to be taught by the Old Testament. But it does sort of put a kind of bracket around at least parts of the Old Testament and say, look, it may be that there's a new vision we need to look at presented in the New Testament. What is that vision? Well, there are a couple of passages in the New Testament that seem to refer to same-sex conduct. One, or actually it's two, because it gets repeated in two places, one in Timothy, one in Corinthians, so Paul's letters. And Paul gives a list of people who have turned away from God, either idolaters or fornicators and so on. And there's a word in there that's very difficult to translate, actually two words, malachois and arsenokoites, which in some translations of the Bible is translated as homosexual offenders, in some places it's sodomites. Very hard word to translate because it doesn't appear elsewhere, which goes back to my issue of how do we know what God is saying? What's the historical context here? The other passage, which is considered a pretty important passage, is in Romans, where Paul talks about the effects of turning away from God and points to a case where this caused them to turn away from God, give up their natural relations for unnatural, receiving the due penalty of their error. But if you look at the context of that passage, it seems pretty clear that, again, what Paul is concerned with there is primarily idolatry. These are people who turned away from true religion, and as a result of that, these various things happen. Should that be read as a blanket condemnation of all homosexual conduct? I'm not sure that it should. Going back to the New Testament again, Paul also said, slaves, obey your masters. We can pull that out of context too. I think it's really important to look at the context. David mentioned that I have an anthology there. That anthology is a collection of readings from a variety of people on various sides of this issue, including a couple of people who talk about the Romans passage. Thomas Schmidt, who gives a sort of traditionalist interpretation, interprets that passage as condemning homosexual conduct. Daniel Halminiak, who says, no, if you pay attention to the context, that's not what the passage is doing. I would encourage you to look further at that and some other such writings to find out more about those passages. Yes, Richard.
I want to bring up the issue of incest. You know, the issue of rejecting religions by homosexuals, and bring the homosexual issue to the majority. And correct me if I'm wrong. But I'm wondering if there's like an issue with how homosexual, the whole, maybe are using certain issues to expose themselves more, but at the same time are hindering how people associate with other issues such as.
Okay, the question, if I understand it, and I'll repeat the question because I realize it's hard to hear in here, has to do with the connection between homosexuality and AIDS and HIV, and in particular with whether the homosexual community has done the right things in terms of how it handles the disease, particularly, this is the part where I get a little unclear.
Become like our issue because maybe we made it.
Well, okay, so whether it's become our issue. It is true that in this country, the first community to be hit hardest by the HIV was the gay male community. And there are physiological reasons for this with how the virus is passed along. It's easier for the receptive partner to contract it than for the quote-unquote active or penetrative partner. If you have a group where people are penetrating other, you have men having sex with men, it makes sense that it would be easier to pass along the HIV virus that way. It's not true that if you look at the phenomenon worldwide, it's primarily the gay community. If you look at Africa and other places, it's not. And I think one of the things that it's important for the gay community to do, beyond pointing out that this is not just a gay disease, is also to point out that while, yes, it hit us first and hardest, that doesn't mean that we are to be blamed for it somehow. Let me finish and I'll get back to you. It doesn't mean that we are to be blamed for it somehow. Indeed, if you want to talk about morality, it strikes me as very interesting that many of the so-called moral majority, their response to AIDS has been to blame the people who were hit hardest by it first in this country. And that seems to me the most immoral response. If you find a particular community that's at risk for something, the thing to do is to say, okay, how can we minimize this risk, not to start blaming them. So I think that that's been unfortunate. Go ahead.
I'm not saying that we're hit somebody, nor am I saying that we have to do it, but I'm wondering, none of the associations are originally created. That's what the assumption is.
I don't think we've created the assumption that it's a gay disease just because we were hit by it and responded to it. I mean, I think that because we were hit hardest by it, because we as a community responded to it, it has become associated with us. I don't think there was any sort of deliberate decision to make this our issue. Other questions? In the back. I'm sorry, I can't hear you at all. Could you maybe?
Yeah, as far as the next presidential election, do you foresee the federal marriage amendment and all this to be more of a bipartisan effect where people look at it and say, okay, they're out of step with the times? Or do you see it as a common way to attract all of these homophobes?
What do I think the effect of the federal marriage amendment will be on the upcoming election? It's hard to say, because on the one hand, I think that we've, as a society, come a ways on this issue, and are better than we are when I started doing this in the early 90s. On the other hand, people in this country are unsettled right now for a lot of reasons, economic and so on. And when people are unsettled and when they're hurting in various ways, they often look for scapegoats and people to blame and things to sort of grasp onto where they feel they have a sense of control. And I do think that that's happening with the issue, where look at these gay people trying to wreck the institution of marriage becomes an easy distraction that helps us avoid thinking about some of the serious, difficult moral issues that are facing us. Whether the Republicans' use of the federal marriage amendment will ultimately backfire on them, I guess the election will tell part of that tale. Although it's sort of hard to tease out that issue from all the other factors and what affects people's voting habits.
I have just, I'm not so much a question, more of a commentary on, I guess, sort of how natural, homosexuality is, and just kind of bringing it back to how, animals act. I don't know if you've heard, I think it's like a San Diego Zoo,
Yeah, it's actually Central Park in New York that has the gay penguins. I think this is really funny. There's a gay penguins. They have a really well-decorated igloo or something. I don't know. Because we sort of extrapolate from human. I mean, to even apply these categories to animals is weird, but it is true that they engage in the same-sex pair bonding. And one of the reasons birds are interesting is that birds are a lot like humans in that they often pair off in relationships and are monogamous and pursue these lifelong relationships with mating pair. And this particular group of penguins is not only these two male penguins sort of set up a home, if you will, together, but are also successfully raising baby penguins together that they were providing. What does this tell us about the moral issue? Very little, I think, if anything, but it's interesting. It makes me laugh when I hear people say that they think philosophers have too much time on their hands. Well, look at them what the natural scientists are working on. Hey, it's interesting.
I don't know if it's so much a moral question, more of a big part of the debate of whether homosexual people should be allowed to, adopt or use it. Yeah, and just, I don't know, I guess it's sort of, a proof that is possible and that can be done helpfully in some species.
Yeah, I have no doubt that people look to this and say, well, look, if animals are doing this, I mean, some people feel better about it for that reason. Just as some people look to the whole nature-nurture debate, and if they believe that there's some kind of genetic factor there, they tend to be more accepting of same-sex conduct. As a philosopher, I don't think that there's any good rational reason to make that connection, but it does happen for a lot of people that way, and so it does have that effect.
There's any other studies that have been done to show how gender orientation is determined.
It's determined by...
How is it determined?
Well, there are lots of studies that have tried to determine the origins of sexual orientation. I think the scientific jury is still out on this question. One book I would recommend is Edward Stein's book, The Mismeasure of Desire, where he talks about a lot of the studies that have been done and some of the flaws in those studies. But there do seem to be certainly some biological components there. I mean, you could say that there are biological components in all human desires. We're biological creatures. The danger is that we sort of oversimplify some of the studies and then look for something like the gay gene that is somehow determinative of sexual orientation. I think that's where we go too far.
There's a sort of idea gender orientation indicated by mixing of genes on 24 chromosomes, or is it created by, say, observing your parents in a very critical period of time, or is it created by, let's say, the society passing on rules about that proper gender orientation, or the mixture of any two or all three?
Yeah, and it's probably a complex mixture of several things, and I think we're still trying to figure all of that out. My take on the issue is, well, it's interesting to figure all that out. It shouldn't change how we treat gay and lesbian people in our society today.
But if I'm going to come out, let's say, is that if it's gender is created by observing genders and social standards, maybe, I remember I hadn't think of it as being by something totally, but that homosexualism is really strongly than homosexualism is dedicated to heterosexuality.
It's certainly true that if a person believes that we have that kind of direct influence on the sexual orientation of children, where by simple modeling behavior we can make a child straight or gay, and if that person is against homosexuality, then they're probably going to try to do things in society to affect children so that they turn out straight. There is no evidence that we have that kind of direct control on children's sexual orientations because, after all,
virtually all of us who are gay, or at least most of us who are gay, grew up in heterosexual households. You had a question?
I was just sort of asked more about relationships with Christianity or homosexuality. It seems like in modern society, lesbianism is less known about but more accepted. More people are okay with lesbian or bisexual women than gay or homosexual men, and it almost seems like sort of, I know about in Catholicism, if you take the rule out of the equation, then there is no ability to procreate. And it almost seems like it's sort of related back to, the marital and infection or whatever. And it sort of has formed a weird question about why lesbianism is more accepted, less known about, and not.
So the question is about why lesbianism seems to be, on the one hand, less known about, on the other hand, more accepted. And you thought maybe that might have some connection with Christianity, and particularly Catholicism's emphasis on the importance of the womb. I think it's a more general issue of sexism in our society, where women are simply not taken as seriously as actors in our society, as contributors, people in our society. So what they do sexually is not regarded by many as important as what men do. It also has to do with this notion, I think, of people who view men as superior and women as inferior. For a man to take the quote-unquote female role in sex is thought of as being very degrading, whereas for a woman to take the male role is considered a kind of step up. I don't know that people think through those things in a conscious way and do it that way, but I do think there are ties with how women and men in general are thought of in our society, which is why I think there are ties between sexism and heterosexism. Time for a few more.